Hello, welcome to another in my Cold War series of videos. Today we're looking at one of the largest NATO exercises of the final years of the Cold War. Exercise Reforger 1987, otherwise known as Exercise Certain Strike. Okay, full disclosure, I was on this exercise. This is me in 1987 as a newly promoted corporal in the British Army. My first command was an anti-tank detachment with an FV-432 armoured personnel carrier. Exercise Certain Strike was my first major exercise, and this is my detachment on Certain Strike. I'm on the right with the binos. Well, enough about me. We'll start this video off with an introduction from the West German news in 1987.
NATO-Manöver Certain Strike in Norddeutschland. 78.000 Soldaten aus 5 Staaten nahmen daran teil. Zum Manöverkonzept der NATO gehört auch die alljährliche Einsatzübung Reforger der amerikanischen Streitkräfte. Reforger bedeutet Return of Forces to Germany, Rückführung der Streitkräfte nach Deutschland. Bereits zum 19. Mal übten die Amerikaner ein komplettes Armeekorps mit der gesamten Ausrüstung in 24 Stunden durch die Luft von den USA nach Deutschland zu verlegen. Das große Herbstmanöver, das dieses Jahr Certain Strike genannt wurde, also sicherer Schlag, wurde entsprechend den Bestimmungen der Konferenz von Stockholm über vertrauensbildende Maßnahmen und Abrüstung in Europa allen Staaten vorher angekündigt. Beobachter kamen auch aus den Staaten Osteuropas. Deutsche Panzerverbände mit Leopardpanzern übten gemeinsam mit den Pionieren den Übergang über einen Fluss. Mit einem gewaltigen Arsenal ausgerüstet, nahmen amerikanische, niederländische, britische und belgische Soldaten an der Übung teil. Trotz vieler Sprachen machte die Verständigung und Zusammenarbeit keine Schwierigkeiten.
Since most of my viewers are too young to remember, and to give some context to the rest of this video, it's necessary to step back in time to the early to mid 1980s. Back then, the world was a much simpler place, and we had what was known as the Three World Order. The First World, or Western Bloc, were the Western democracies, headed by the superpower, the USA. The Second World, or Eastern Bloc, were countries governed or controlled by international communism, dominated by the Soviet Union and People's Republic of China. The rest of the world, made up of unaligned, often poor countries, was known as the Third World. Today the phrase Third World is misused out of context to mean any poor country. The forces of communism and democracy were often in conflict. On occasion, this developed into hot wars on borders between the two ideologies in places you will have heard of, such as Korea and Vietnam. Other borders between the two simmered in a Cold War, where the ideologies squared up to each other but never actually fought. The starkest frontier between Western democracy and Eastern communism was in Central Europe. After World War II in 1945, Germany was split into two by the Allied powers. This eventually became two separate countries: West Germany, a democracy, and East Germany, a communist satellite state of the Soviet Union. The border between East and West Germany, known as the German border, was not just an ideological one. From 1961 onwards, the Soviets closed and then heavily fortified it, with over 1,000 miles of fences, armed guards, watchtowers and minefields. The border became known around the world as the Iron Curtain. As intimidating as the Iron Curtain was, it was what sat 10 to 50 kilometres behind it that was a clear and present danger to the West. The vast military strength The combined strength of the Warsaw Pact and Soviet Union in Europe was almost double that in some respects to the forces of NATO, whilst it was understood that battlefield nuclear and chemical weapons would hold the balance of power in any conflict. Despite the threat posed by the forces of the Warsaw Pact in 1968, due to pressure on the armed forces caused by the Vietnam War, the US withdrew 2 divisions from West Germany. To allay fears from NATO that this weekend the US resolved to defend Europe, the US committed to returning those forces within 24 hours if hostilities seemed likely. This concept became known as the Return of Forces to Germany, or by its acronym, Reforger. The concept of Reforger was the rapid movement of troops and equipment from their garrisons in North America by military airlift and sea lift, with combat elements arriving in Europe within 24 hours, and sea lift units and equipment arriving within 7 to 10 days. By the 1980s, 3 US corps were designated in the Reforger role. The concept was exercised annually in varying degrees and in varying magnitudes from 1969 onwards. Each exercise after 1971 was known by its year. So, in 1987, we had exercise Reforger 87. Due to the political situation in the mid-1980s in Europe, exercise Reforger 87 was designed to be the biggest ever deployment. And for the first time since World War II, an entire US corps would be moved from North America. Due to peacetime constraints, the 1 to 7 day timescale could not be met, so the movement would take around 20 days. And on the 21st of August 1987, the first Reforger forces began arriving in the seaport of Rotterdam and at various airfields and airports throughout the Netherlands. As soon as US Reforger units arrived in the country, they moved through Pomkers depots to equip, arm and deploy. A key element of the Reforger concept was the pre-deployment of heavy equipment. If US forces needed to travel with their tanks, armoured and wheeled vehicles and ammunition, the deployment would take weeks or months, not days. So Reforger units' heavy equipment was pre-deployed and waiting for them in warehouses in the Netherlands and Belgium. This was known as Pomkers, standing for pre-positioning of material configured in unit sets. Thus, a tank battalion based in Texas could jump onto a transport plane and in 10 hours land in Amsterdam, be bussed straight to a Pomkers depot, pick up their M1 battle tanks and be in combat within 24 hours. By the late 1980s, the Western European population was tiring of the armed standoff between East and West, and arriving US Reforger forces did not always meet with a warm welcome. It's important to point out that although they're used synonymously, Reforger 87 and Exercise Certain Strike were two entirely separate exercises. Reforger 87 was a real-world logistics exercise in moving 3 US Corps from Texas to mainland Europe. Exercise Certain Strike was a Northern Army Group field training exercise that utilised in-country multinational forces and incorporated Reforger forces from 3 US Corps as a reinforcement. As you can see from the map, Exercise Certain Strike would utilise about 1/8 of West German territory. The Certain Strike exercise area was broken down into 3 distinct zones, largely due to peacetime constraints. As it would take around 20 days to complete the move of 3 US Corps from Texas, on arrival, individual units would move into a staging area, which was non-tactical, where they would be held in existing barracks on airfields and industrial areas. The deployment area was for 3 US Corps to shake out into battle formation and move up to the FTX area. All movement in this area, though, was on roads, usually escorted by the German civil police. And finally, the FTX area allowed for tactical movement off-road. It's strange to remember now, but we really were allowed to drive tanks across West German farmland. Although in practice, this was controlled by umpires to limit unnecessary damage to German real estate. And most tank battles took place on the dedicated tank training areas within the FTX area. Before we progress on to the exercise itself, we will take a look at both sides' orders of battle. Neither list is exhaustive. NATO forces, commanded by Headquarters Northern Army Group, consisted of the 1st Bundeswehr Panzer Division, based in Hanover, and reinforced by US Reforger units from the 3rd US Corps, principally the 1st US Cavalry Division and 2nd US Armoured Division. The OPFOR, opposing forces, known as Orange Forces, we always used the euphemism orange when we really meant red forces, was a multinational division playing a Soviet corps, and this was provided by troops from the UK, Holland, Belgium and France. Finally, to convey the sheer size of Exercise Certain Strike, I'll just let the figures speak for themselves. Another indicator of changing times, thanks to the measures agreed in the Stockholm Conference in 1986. For the first time, Soviet and East German military observers were invited to observe the exercise. After weeks of preliminary movement and long waits, D-Day of Exercise Certain Strike was imminent. 3 US Corps was given their initial scenario and required by Northag to move up and hold in the real estate to the west of Hanover. The Corps moved up on highways in 6 columns of advance over the next 48 hours. The opening scenario of Exercise Southern Strike was that hostilities had broken out between Orange forces and NATO. Orange forces had crossed the inner German border, simulated in this exercise by the B7 highway, and a core level force was pushing rapidly west across the North German plain with the intention of securing the river Weser from Bremerhaven to Hanover within 1 to 4 days. Commander Northag's concept was to engage and block them with the in-country 1 Panzer Division of the Bundeswehr in the line spanning the Aller and Weser River, and a mobile defence in the villages forward to the east. 3 US Corps, having arrived in the Netherlands, would move up to a position 30 kilometres southwest and act as Army Group Reserve. The first day or so of the exercise was fairly quiet, with both NATO and Orange forces conducting air and ground reconnaissance. But by the third day, the air war was firmly underway. 3 US Corps were subject to Orange air interdiction, taking their first casualties. Orange forces had moved up in strength and were now closing in on 1 Panzer Division's defences to the north-east of the Aller River. Three US Corps received orders from Commander Northag to conduct a passage of lines through 1 Panzer Division across the Weser and Aller rivers and to secure the zone to the east in order to launch a corps-level counterattack against the advancing Orange forces. This operation necessitated using combat and fixed bridges to cross the rivers. But as planning was underway, Orange changed the situation by launching a battalion-level helicopter-borne attack on the main bridge over the River Aller.
Come on! Let's start digging in! Right, take up your positions now, Oxford. Right, steady on. Right, the best is, we've got it now, right? Calm down, let's get on with it steadily. We've got to get hold of the engineers, get them working as teams. Send a runner to them now, okay? Ready? Yeah! Let's go. Right.
As the bridge over the Aller was lost and destroyed, principally to prevent its use by the US forces or to prevent 1 Panzer Division withdrawing over it, The Germans found their positions to the east under attack by armour and infantry in the villages, forcing them to withdraw westwards back towards the River Aller. This was designed in exercise play to put US 3 Corps under pressure to cross the rivers and secure the east bank of the Aller before it was lost to Orange forces.
On the crossroads, sir.
Watch the crossroads, just watch the crossroads.
To interdict and delay Orange force progress, US divisional artillery in the form of the new MLRS system was deployed in simulated fire plans, whilst the corps level bridging operation got underway. Three US Corps' crossing of the Razor River was done largely out of contact, despite being harassed by Orange air. However, the crossing of the Aller River needed the creation of secure bridgeheads in order to do this without Orange interference. The 45th US Infantry Brigade was airlifted to the eastern bank of the Aller in 4 separate bridgeheads. It was during this airlift operation that Certain Strike suffered its first major no-play casualty when a UH-60 crashed during the operation. With the passage of lines with 1 Panzer Division completed and the eastern bank of the Alice secure, 3 US Corps halted for 2 days. And the reason for that is a weekend the exercise stopped so not to disrupt German civilian life. With the start of the second week of the exercise, this would see 3 US Corps counterattack Orange forces and then advance northeast to clear Orange forces within boundaries to a limit of exploitation just south of the city of Lüneburg. This was a 2-divisional advance, the 1st US Cavalry Division left and the 2nd US Armoured Division right. The diagram you can see is a very simplified view of Week 2. There were a number of engagements between Orange and 3 US Corps. Cleverly, most of these took place on permanent tank training grounds of Bergen-Hohne, Soltau-Lüneburg and Münster North to minimise damage to German real estate. In most cases, Orange forces withdrew once engaged by NATO armour, except in a location just south of the town of Soltau, near a village known as Villingen, in what became known as the Battle of Villingen. Designed by exercise planners so that divisional and corps staff could deal with a major setback, Orange stood and fought with armour and dug-in infantry to inflict major damage on the advancing US forces. Also, to keep the rear echelon and various headquarters on their toes, during the night, Orange launched a number of special forces infantry raids and attacks. Unfortunately, from this point onwards, the archival footage doesn't really do justice to the second week of the exercise. That was a lot more kinetic than it appears from the footage. By the 23rd of September, 3 US Corps had reached their limit of exploitation. In reality, this was the northern edges of the NATO tank training areas. Orders were given for the next phase, a Corps level clearance towards the inner German border. Of course, this was notional, to test commanders and headquarters, and as most large exercises end, not in a moment of euphoric victory and flag waving, but simply in a sense of anticlimax. At around 0800 hours on the 24th of September, NX was given over every combat radio net, both NATO and Orange.
Ladies and gentlemen, it gives me very great pleasure to be here to talk to you at the end of our exercise. We must never forget that we are here to prevent a war from happening. We are the true peacekeepers. Sadly, there is still a potential threat to our way of life. Therefore, it is necessary for us to train together in order that we can keep the peace. Exercise Certain Strike was a vital exercise in our program of training to keep the peace in the world. First of all, it enabled us, the European members of Northern Army Group, to test the capability of the in-place forces. And while we were doing this, thanks to the generosity of the United States of America, we were allowed to incorporate the 3rd US Corps into our plan. Firstly, I must thank all the officers and men of 6 different armies and air forces that took part on this exercise. The exercise was a great success and achieved all its aims in a way which I have seldom seen before. But finally, I must, in reality, thank you, the people of this part of Germany, for putting up with us so wonderfully well. Thank you all very much indeed.
As any soldier will tell you, the worst part of any exercise is the recovery phase. The job is done, you're tired, and all you want to do is go home. For us Orange forces, we were back in our barracks within days. But for the US Reforger forces, the process was long and laborious, to return equipment back to POMCUS depots and then to travel back to the US mainland. The whole process took nearly a month. And that was the end of Reforger 87 and Exercise Certain Strike, but not the end of the story, as none of us could have foretold the seismic geopolitical changes that were about to happen right there in Central Europe.
A historic moment tonight. The Berlin Wall can no longer contain the East German people. Thousands pouring across at the Bornholmer Bridge.
NBC Nightly News with Tom Brokaw. Tonight from West Berlin.
Good evening, live from the Berlin Wall on the most historic night in this wall's history. What you see behind me is a celebration of this new policy announced today by the East German government that now, for the first time since the wall was erected in 1961, people will be able to move through freely.
In Moscow, the hammer and sickle is lowered for the last time, and an era comes to an end.
Я прекращаю свою деятельность.
I am ceasing my activities in the post of President of the USSR.
The tricolor banner of the Russian Republic now flies over the Kremlin. And from the White House, President Bush salutes the man who presided over the end of the Soviet Union.
In reflection, although not at the time, as me and my team sat in the cold, wet and rain near Villingen, all of those of us who took part in certain strike played a little part in history. The collapse of the Soviet Union was supposed to make the world a safer place. It did not. And many of us who practiced our tactics in 1987 on the North German plain would use them for real in combat in Iraq and Kuwait in 1991.